Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to you all. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Liza Oliver, Associate Professor of Art History at Wellesley College, who will be presenting the second South Asian Studies Colloquium of 2022. Professor Oliver is an art historian whose work focuses on 18th and 19th century Europe and South Asia, and the visual cultures of colonialism, slavery, and global trade. Their research concerns aesthetic and intellectual exchange between Europe, South Asia, and the West Indies in the 18th and 19th centuries, and attendant methods for interpreting material and visual culture, both within and beyond colonial frameworks. Professor Oliver's first book, Art, Trade, and Imperialism in Early Modern French India, published by the Amsterdam University Press in 2019, examined the integration of the French East India Company with the 18th century textile industries of India's southeast coast. And their current book project, Empire of Hunger, representing famine, land, and labor in colonial India, explores the many famines that devastated South Asia in the second half of the 19th century, and how photographs aided in the constitution of British colonial policies around famine, land, and agricultural labor. Uniting art historical analysis with political ecology and environmental and food studies, this project aims to illuminate the fraught convergence of economic liberalism and colonial humanitarianism around the issue of famine in colonial India. Drawn from this ongoing project, Professor Oliver's talk today is titled Visualizing Peasant and Bovine Self-Sustainability in the Famine Tracts of Colonial India. My name is Akshay Tankha, and I'm an art historian of modern and contemporary South Asia and a postdoctoral associate and lecturer at the South Asian Studies Council. I'll be chairing the question and answer session that will follow at the end of the talk today. I want to let the attendees know that they are free to type in their questions and comments into the Q&A chat box, either during or at the conclusion of the presentation. And I will read them out for Professor Oliver to take up afterwards. The talk will go for about 50 minutes, which should give us another 40 to 45 minutes for discussion. So without further delay, Liza, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction. As you mentioned, this is a project that is part of a larger book project I'm working on right now that considers a lot of photographs that have been largely not considered in the scholarship on famine in colonial India during the second half of the 19th century. And I actually started this project right before COVID hit, but because of the delays and disruptions that has caused, this is actually the first time I'm presenting this publicly. So I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm looking forward to hearing your feedback. So let me go ahead and share my screen to get started. Okay. A laborer presses his hand against a sack at the rear of a cart weighted with grain, which extends the length of the photograph. The hue of his flesh contrasts starkly with the barren landscape that surrounds him. Ostensibly, he is poised to assist the four other laborers at front who bear the majority of the load. The narrative and composition of this photograph center on two absences: fertile land and, most glaringly, cattle. Humans, replacing their bovine counterparts at the yoke of the cart, are reduced to beasts of burden. The photograph's title provides the reason: grain cart drawn by coolies, nearly all the cattle in the district having died. Known for commercial photographs that push the limits of the macabre, Willoughby Hooper was a British colonial official stationed in Madras in the 1870s, after having been restationed from his posting in Burma after controversially photographing prisoners as they were executed. Like so many of his photographs, grain cart drawn by coolies, taken during the Madras famine of the 1870s, was probably choreographed. The men appear stiff and static in their poses, disavowing their purported forward momentum. Nonetheless, the photograph lays bare one truth: the inextricably linked fate of human and bovine agricultural laborers, especially in times of famine. In 1870, Viceroy of India, Lord Mayo, made a bold declaration: the only Indian landlord who can command the requisite knowledge and capital for the improvement of the land is the state, he declared. At the time of this declaration, India had already undergone 3 major famines since the establishment of the Raj just 12 years prior. Another 4 major famines would ravage the subcontinent by the century's end. Coinciding with the transition of British power from the East India Company to the Raj, these famines necessitated an official set of policies that would buttress the Raj's self-image as a benevolent colonial government. Raj policies adopted to address India's repeated famines in this period were far-ranging, even if desultory, from land infrastructure and irrigation projects, famine camps and government relief works, and studies in human, animal, and land measurements through the burgeoning disciplines of scientific agriculture and statistical analysis. Photographs of such projects from this period reveal the tensions and paradoxes of colonial governance, which sought to respond to newfound conceptions of famine and starvation as a social and state responsibility, even as the Raj encouraged policies that greatly exacerbated the causes and effects of famine. In particular, today I'm going to consider photographs of cattle competitions at agricultural fairs in the second half of the 19th century, putting art historical analysis in dialogue with British agriculture and food policy in India. These photographs helped constitute the fraught convergence of the historically specific ideologies of economic liberalism and colonial humanitarianism surrounding the issue of famine in India. This convergence, as I'll argue, resulted in the photographic creation of a new kind of state subject, the self-sustained riot with his bovine counterpart, distilled to units of productivity within a profitable and ostensibly mutually beneficial capitalist structure. Simultaneously, these photographs reveal inadvertent traces of alternative bovine-peasant relationships that unsettle and undermine this newly conceptualized state subject. So cattle were key elements around which famine policies were formulated, and the colonial state studied, evaluated, and measured bovine laborers for potential improvement due to their essential role in agricultural production. Photography was central to this endeavor. As photographic theorist John Tagg has argued, in the second half of the 19th century, photography was bound up with the emergence of new institutions and new practices of observation and record keeping. That is, those new techniques of representation and regulation, which were so central to the restructuring of the local and national state. While Tagg's study is geographically focused on the industrial centers of Western Europe and America, the arrival of photography in India and its widespread use by administrators after the 1857 rebellion involved its implication in similar, albeit socially and politically specific context of state regulating and restructuring. The surviving photographs of cattle that I consider were part of a larger project implemented by administrators through schools, educational programs, and government departments across India to classify agricultural practices and then modernize and scientize every component of them. The so-called responsible husbandry practices developed by agricultural scientists through these programs were then conveyed to the public and encouraged by the state through sponsored cattle competitions at agricultural fairs. The ostensible aim of such educational outreach was to achieve peasant self-sustainability, particularly in times of famine. The narrative of self-sustainability, however, only ever operated within a framework of and in service to maximizing capital production of the land for the Raj's extractive trade policies. The impact on livestock of the 19th century famines that devastated South Asia was significant, even if it's often overlooked relative to the overwhelming human losses. During the famine of 1899 to 1900, for example, the Punjab recorded deaths as high as 43% among draft and plow cattle. Because draft cattle were the most valuable, it should be assumed that the number of total bovine fatalities was significantly higher, since cattle deemed less important would have been allowed to die in order to divert resources to more important cattle. As historian Saurabh Mishra has shown, cattle were central to the agricultural economy, and it would take decades for agricultural laborers to recover from the financial impact caused by the high mortality rates of cattle during any given famine. Malthusian disciples, of which there were many among Raj administrators, sometimes describe the loss of cattle as more regrettable occurrence than the loss of human life. For example, in one 1874 report, it noted that, and I quote, "In its influence on agriculture, cattle mortality is perhaps a more serious and lasting evil than the loss of population. As a rule, those who die of hunger must be old or helpless," which wasn't actually necessarily true, "whereas the able-bodied and useful escape, but if the cattle perish, cultivation is almost impossible." So contrary to what this quote may imply, though, cattle were also subjected to Malthusian logic in times of famine. Cattle camps established during famines strictly denied admission to weaker cattle, determined by their breed, age, and health, which would have allowed them to graze or sometimes forage on dried grass imported from other locales. Another photograph by Willoughby Hooper orphans at a relief camp preparing prickly leaves of prickly pear as forage for cattle, alludes to the parallel drawn by the colonial state between human and animal relief. These children are in an unknown famine camp, but most likely somewhere in the Madras presidency where Hooper was stationed. Despite several instances of blurring, suggesting the difficulty of the children had in remaining still during the long exposure, particularly with the central figure here, most of these children seem to have dutifully performed their dual role as laborer and photographic subject. They focus on the tedious work of removing thorns from the cacti to make them edible for cattle. Meanwhile, a young woman with an infinite right, though not involved in the labor of the scene, fulfills the purpose of feminizing famine, helping to solicit a heightened sense of moral sentimentality in voyeuristic viewers. The labor of these children, who are themselves nourished by the state, will feed cows and bullocks in cattle camps stricken by the famine. To most British audiences, this image would have conveyed the inherent logic and rationality of colonial humanitarianism, an efficient symbiosis between human and animal aid in times of famine, all made possible by British rule. In fact, though, implicit in this image is how specific British policies subsumed human and non-human laborers alike into quantifiable entities of cost, productivity, health, strength, and necessity for the sake of capital output. But for this to be clear, it's necessary to give a brief summary of British land policies. And I just have to say that in the summary, I'm reducing what are very complex issues that have been written about by multiple historians to a one-page summary for the sake of time. So it's a bit reductive. Central to the fraught intersection of humanitarianism and economic liberalism was that British administrators often framed and visualized India's famines as caused by droughts. To use historian David Arnold's terms, the British defined famine as an event and not a structure, even though famines were due to a confluence of both drought and Raj economic policies that were devastating to India's peasantry. At one level, beginning in the 1860s, the Raj expanded its commissioning of large-scale surveys of India's land with the intent of identifying all land ripe for future exploitation. These wastelands, as they were deemed, became eligible for zoning and sale without regard to non-profitable purposes the land may have served for nearby villages. Common lands in particular, which were lands historically shared by villagers to forage and allow their cattle to graze, were deemed particularly ripe for profits. This new colonial land system meant that former peasants subsisting jointly on common land now became tenants of the land's new leaser, where they were burdened with exploitative rents and interest rates that left them perpetually indebted. In addition to the rapid disappearance of common lands, the British severely restricted entry into forests to feed cattle, making access a profitable opportunity whereby they sold limited, often cost-prohibitive passes for the right to graze within forests. As Laxman Satya has perfectly summarized, every act of governance was designed to derive maximum profits at minimum cost to the state. Furthermore, the Raj strictly adhered to a free trade policy regarding the resources it extracted from India. The ideology of economic liberalism, built on the theories of thinkers like Adam Smith and James Mill, had been codified as an unassailable truth in British thought by the mid-19th century. Unfettered markets were sacrosanct, leaving it impossible for already impoverished ryots to afford inflated grain prices in capital markets left unchecked to supply and demand when scarcity from drought did occur. But of course, the Raj didn't paint its own tenancy and trade policies as a failure. Rather, and wrapped in an ethos of paternalism, it posited that the real failure of the state was in not having effectively trained ryots to manage their land and cattle according to scientific principles of irrigation, soil rotation, and cattle breeding. As Eugene Schrottke declared in his 1876 Principles of Rational Agriculture applied to India and its staple products, and I quote, "The Indian ryot does badly because of his never having been taught better. Should we not try to inculcate in the ryot the principles of an improved method of cultivation?" And when I use the word scientific and rational principles and methods of cultivation as defined by figures like Schrottke, what I mean is any process of restructuring and simplification that made agricultural production legible, standardized, systematized, and quantifiable to the state while improving output in capital production. When what is beneficial to society is defined by that which most enriches capital markets through maximized extraction, it is understandable that self-sufficiency and self-sustainability would become the government's official language and method of remediation in times of famine-induced crisis. This is how cattle competitions in agricultural fairs, for however ill-fitting a solution to famine as they were, became a key prong in government policy to provide riots with the tools of self-sustainability. Now, the agricultural fairs that sponsored cattle competitions echoed to a degree the colonial and universal expositions held in Europe, and that they sometimes house cultural and artistic exhibitions showcasing artwork from European artists or other colonial territories. But the fair's overwhelming focus was on Indian agriculture. Anywhere from 3,000 to 40,000 cattle could be brought to a given fair, depending on location and size of the fairground. The surviving photographs of cattle competitions come from only a small handful of the total number of agricultural fairs held, but all of the fairs were linked in aim and ideology, so I'm going to be drawing on textual sources from a broad range of fairs to illuminate these photographs. There were typically several competitions for the same type of animals. For one for elite entries, one for small proprietors, and one for all classes. For example, the Raja of Balrampur's first prize English bull, which shows a full symbolic attended by one of the Raja's servants, would have competed apart from the generically identified long-horned Awad bullock. The conventions of representation are nonetheless identical. Profile views that allow the cattle's anatomy and form to be seen to the fullest extent. We can only surmise the audience for these photographs. Likely they were produced for prize winners to memorialize their win and to showcase to their fellow villagers, and most certainly for agricultural departments to aid their efforts at cataloging and teaching good husbandry practices. The rationale behind these fairs was simple. An 1871 article in the Agricultural Gazette of India states the following of the fair at Amritsar. Government has an opportunity open to it here to improve the breed of cattle at no expense to itself and very little trouble attending it. Another article in the same journal goes on to emphasize how these fairs should encourage sympathy for the riots. It should be noted that sympathetic connection and moral sentimentality were understood to be entirely congruent with Raj ideology and policy in India, seeing as they undergirded Smithian belief in the beneficial nature of economic liberalism to society. And I'm quoting again from the Agricultural Gazette. Those who go to these exhibitions, and the judges also, should imagine themselves in the native's place. They should master his wants and appreciate the means at his disposal. And starting from that point, they should frame their scheme accordingly, so that one result would be that when famine afflicts the country again, there would be greater accumulations from fruitful seasons instead of that hopeless apathy and inability to help themselves, of which we have lately heard so much, end quote. Except for the photographic evidence of the competition winners, there's actually very little information about the outcomes of these competitions, such as the extent to which favorable husbandry practices that led to a prize cattle may have been disseminated and adopted locally, or the extent to which winning cattle would have been used in improving husbandry standards. But there is a significant amount of information concerning desired outcomes and how those were hindered by problems with the fair's general administration. For example, in the aftermath of the 1871 Amritsar Fair, the staff writers of the Agricultural Gazette of India fumed that administrators had done a poor job conveying to attendees which type of cattle would be prioritized, resulting in a disproportionate number of cattle being entered into the competition who were used for general farm work, as opposed to draft cattle used for the most important elements of agricultural production, or dairy cattle, or dairy cows. To this end, the Gazette published an ideal prize list to be adopted at future fairs. It divided winning animals by sex and age. The first prize for both bulls and cows is devoted to those likely to improve the breed of cattle for draft purposes, with secondary priority given to those likely to improve the breed for milking, and last priority given to cattle suitable for general farm work. Generally, the most common criticism surrounding these fairs pertain to the actual judging of the cattle entered in the competition. Administrators regularly complained that there were not sufficient standardized criteria to judge properly, written in language understandable to a lay person. This raised the risk of prizes being awarded in ignorance to inferior animals by British criteria, which would impress a false notion on Indians of what good husbandry practices should produce. As a staff writer for the Gazette bemoaned, in judging cattle, the result is that in too many cases, a good fat animal or one with a pretty face carries off the prize. One particularly harsh statement in an 1871 issue of the Gazette is noteworthy for what it reveals of concerns about leaving Indians in charge of judging competitions. And I quote from that here. "There is in some quarters a disposition to trust to natives for judgment in such matters, but natives are for the most part much more ignorant about cattle breeding than the most ordinary European. A European will bring to the field a bull perfect in every fiber of its muscles and the condition of a racehorse with its pedigree and its progeny to witness for it. Indians will prefer a debauched, enervated village Brahmini, a type of cattle, with a skin bursting with fat and a constitution flaccid and vigorless." And this last part is important. "It is as different from a well-bred animal as a sleek Paji Babu would be from a Greek athlete." There is, of course, a long history of conjuring Greco-Roman tradition to criticize anything judged by Western audiences to fall outside of its own perceived heritage. While this discourse was prevalent among 18th century antiquarians to discuss architecture, painting, and sculpture, by the late 18th century, with the rise of polygynous theories of human origins in the face of the abolitionist movement, that discourse extended beyond the arts and into discussions of living humans. In Viret's Natural History of Humankind, for example, the French natural historian juxtaposed a caricaturized stereotype of a Black man's profile between profile views of an orangutan and the famed archetype of classical civilization, the Apollo Belvedere and the Vatican collection, to endorse his view that Africans originate from a different species than Europeans. I raise this here specifically to reiterate the extent to which evoking the ancient Greeks has a very long and loaded history, of which the British author of the above cited passage in the Agricultural Gazette would have no doubt been aware, even if he wasn't aware of this specific example. Anything and everything could find itself subsumed to the measuring stick of Greco-Roman classicism. Architecture, humans, and now even cattle, with Indian babus and Greek athletes serving as their humanoid avatars. The authors of the above passage also make clear the extent to which his leveraging of classical antiquity is for aesthetic judgments that are inextricably linked, even synonymous, with productivity and output. The development of comparative anatomy as a scientific discipline in the second half of the 19th century systematized previously observational knowledge on how to recognize through physical traits the most productive members of a species, whether productivity was determined by speed, strength, or bodily output in other forms, such as milk, wool, or meat. Art historian Anne Macaulay has argued that this created a type of period eye in which it was second nature to integrate judgments about a species' value with aesthetic judgments of that species' discrete body parts. In the case of Indian cattle, we have ample textual descriptions linking intended use with aesthetic judgments. For example, in 1888, Roger Wallace, who was a professor of agriculture and rural economy at the University of Edinburgh, produced what is perhaps the most exhaustive, authoritative, and well illustrated account of Indian cattle breeds to date, derived from his personal tour of India the year prior. It's a veritable exercise in assigning florid language to cattle's body parts. Take, for example, his description of a well-bred Kangam cow, which accompanies a photograph seen here. His text says, "The shoulder is remarkably neat. The thighs are well-rounded, but are not fleshy. The leg bones are thin and refined, showing signs of breeding. The escutcheon in this case is very wide, high up on the thighs," and on his descriptions go. The italics that you see here are his own, which really emblematizes how he parses each anatomical part as a separate unit of analysis instead of treating the animal as a whole. Another expert also remarked on the ideal form a draft cattle should take, and these of course were the premier stars affairs because of their central role in agriculture. This form should be, he says that it should be a beast of large size, having a heavy, powerful forend to take the strain of draft, and a sloping rump, which tends to give a sharp angulation to the hindquarter, which assists in locomotion. There's a strong sense of these qualities being visually manifest in photographs of the prize winners for plow bullocks entered into the competition at a Madras government farm, likely in the 1880s. These bulls possess a burly frontal muscular structure with a noticeably acute angulation to their hindquarters, which were deemed aesthetically commensurate with the animal's productivity for their intended purpose. These surviving photographs and descriptions of Indian cattle build on conventions already established to aid in showcasing prize-winning members of the livestock community and their noteworthy anatomy. In the early to mid-19th century, it was during this period of time that Europe saw at the peak of livestock portraiture within the United Kingdom, which coincided with the rise in prize stock breeding. The mezzotint of the Nubis ox at left and the lithograph of the 23-time prize-winning cow Lady Fragrant, shown at 7 years old, on right, both of which were based on paintings originally commissioned by the cattle's owners, are emblematic of the great strides artists took to showcase the visual qualities associated with the cattle's reason for being bred. Those most favored, as you can see here, really pushed the natural limits, their representations often teetering dangerously on the brink of satire. The oddly rectangular shape of the Nubis ox and Lady Fragrant was a convention intended to draw our eye longingly towards the brisket and rump of the cattle, two meaty parts deemed particularly savory and representative of the cattle's exceptional breeding. As historian Harriet Ritvo has shown, these portraits of cattle had metonymic associations with agricultural improvement. They were intended to embody the values and to project the status of the wealthy, often aristocratic landowners who bred them. For this reason, such paintings usually represent cattle within the context of the owner's rolling, picturesque estate, and the landowners sometimes appear in a portrait beside them. Landowners closely associated the ampleness of their cattle's discrete, meaty parts to their own sense of stature. This sometimes unnerved artists who were uncomfortable with the exaggerations requested of them. The painter Thomas Baywick, for example, who refused to add lumps of fat here and there, as he describes in his journal, lost a commission on this account. In short, British competitive prize breeding was not profitable, but rather designed to showcase the elite status of the gentry who engaged in it. As such, even if similar in kind, it remains fundamentally different in aim from Indian cattle competitions and their accompanying representations of prize cattle. Indian competitions and their representations were about increasing productivity of the land and educating as wide an audience as possible on husbandry practices to facilitate it. Where Indian competitions were similar to their British counterparts was in their promotion of what Ritvo describes as a hegemonic discourse concealed beneath a rhetoric of public service. In British competitions, the gentry was able to affirm its social standing while participating in a rhetoric of patriotism and noblesse oblige, educating fellow countrymen in the best breed selections. In Indian competitions, the Raj was able to encourage practices believed to increase the resource output and profitability of the land, while participating in a rhetoric of beneficence, providing peasants with the tools of self-sustainability. But creating these images within the broader framework and goal of profitability was not without its tensions. Doing so created an entanglement whereby the photographs follow conventions for both portraiture and typology. The prize cattle photographs portray the likeness of a superior individual, a portrait, while highlighting that individual as an ideal to be modeled, or a type. This typology worked in tandem with a broader ethnography of agricultural production that was concurrently underway. Photographs capturing agricultural tools and methods of work, as seen in Barar workers in agricultural implements, were translated into miniature models of tools to classify agricultural practices within an organized and coherent ethnography, as you can see with the maquettes at right. Accompanying the miniatures would be disparately collected biographies of these tools' uses, based on trials that had been conducted on them, sometimes by prisoners, as was the case with plow trials at the Presidency Jail in Calcutta in 1876, which aimed to test their capacities in different types of soil and weather conditions. These essentialized typologies of animals and ethnographies of agricultural practices served as the foundation of study in government agricultural departments, as made evident in Roger Wallace's photograph, the Director of Agriculture for Bombay and office staff, shown here, with posters of cattle breeds hanging from the posts, as you can see here in the back, and maquettes of Indian farmers, plows, and irrigation systems scattered across the table and at bottom left and right. India office records indicate that administrators went to great lengths to commission and procure these types of miniatures with the hope of building collections and exhibiting them for public benefit in such places as the Lucknow Museum and the Economic Museum in Calcutta, among other locations. So we have here a situation in which bovine portrait becomes bovine type and individual peasant becomes maquette. These are the systems of homogenization, uniformity, and simplification that are requisite for the large-scale capitalist overhaul the Raj was attempting to effect. In this way, photographs of prize cattle were more than just templates of good breeding. They were part of a body of training tools used to condition Indian audiences to see cattle, and by extension themselves, through this quantifiable, measurable lens of productivity. These photographs aim to enact in the visual realm what market policies were enacting in the economic and social realm, which was a complete disruption of the effective and historical ties held by peasants to their cattle and their land. To this end, peasants were sometimes even described as measurable entities within this newly implemented system. As one writer from the Agricultural Gazette of India stated about the purpose of the agricultural fairs, and I quote, "Here it is an aim to encourage the smallest cultivator to improve his wretched stock. He is the unit on which the calculation is based." Returning to the already cited passage comparing cattle to Indian babus and Greek athletes, the author of that statement felt the quality of competitions were threatened by Indian judges, not only because of Indians' judgment of aesthetic criteria, but because of what it indicated about the effective relationships between Indians and their cattle, which undergirded their judgment. To cite a part of that passage again, to refamiliarize you with it, he states, "In judging cattle, the result is that in too many cases, a good fat animal or one with a pretty face carries off the prize. Indians will prefer a debauched, enervated village Brahmini with a skin bursting with fat and a constitution flaccid and vigorless." So this passage really underscores what is a genuine anxiety on the part of the British about the failure of their homogenizing aims, about cattle resisting objectification in the eyes of some Indians due to the affective ties they held with their cattle. To be sure, affect is absolutely central to the ideology of colonialism and colonial photography, particularly as it pertains to famine. But such photographs generally function to control and mediate the affective response of the viewer to the subject in a way that coheres contradictory elements to appear inherently compatible. For example, returning to the image of orphans at a relief camp, the camera allows us a sentimental and affective connection with these children through the very systems of extractive capitalism that have brought this so-called benevolent famine camp into existence. In this way, colonialism and humanitarianism are made to appear logically consistent, even coextensive in our eyes. Affect here serves the interest of colonial ideology. But what about when affect interferes with the interests of colonial ideology? Anthropologist Elizabeth Edwards' examination of the long considered idea of presence in photographs is particularly helpful here. Presence is a corrective to photographic theories' overemphasis on recuperating what is the often unknown agency of those photographed. In her words, photographs make not only the photographer's standpoint, but a point of view of those in front of the camera, even if that moment is asymmetrical. Subjects are never passive. Presence within the trace of the photograph is profoundly subjective and profoundly personal, a reclaiming of a moment. It offers a way of capturing the possibility of fleeting affect. Despite the aim of cattle classification, which is at the core of Wallace's tome India in 1887, there are multiple instances where Wallace is compelled to explain under separate heading other elements that make their way into the camera's frame due to the presence of affective ties between Indians and the cattle who appear in the photographs. For example, in his description of Konkan cattle, he gives his characteristic analysis of information most pertinent to their type by dividing his description by their body parts. But in a separate section of his book called General Observations, he returns to this image and several others to discuss elements in them that require further explanation. And I'm quoting from Wallace here. "Native drivers take much pride in the appearance of their animals. which they deck with sheets of gaudy cloth and hang bells and chains about the head and neck. It is a common native practice by way of ornament to gild or paint the horns a most objectionable red or possibly blue color. At times, the painting is carried onto the skin or hair in different parts of the body, which is even more objectionable, end quote. So while it's difficult to see considering the poor quality of Wallace's photographs, I've circled in red here close observation that reveals legs wrapped in bangles, horns capped with metal tips, and painted decorations adorning the cattle in many of his representations. Wallace's repeated reference to these practices as objectionable speaks to British anxiety and frustration regarding forms of Indian affect for cattle that predate, survive, and defy the Raj's capitalist framework. This makes apparent the threat of effective bonds to colonial governmentality when its own ideology does not mediate the conditions of those bonds. Cattle's individualization from these ornaments resist administrators' attempts to subsume bovine laborers into types within their system of standardization. Returning to the cattle and photographs taken at the competitions, it's worth noting that not a single surviving photograph showcases cattle with any ornamentation on them. Considering the ubiquity of the practice, it's clear that contestants were required to remove it before stepping before the camera or entering the competition. When looking at these photographs, we are therefore left to wonder what other untold stories of friendship or frustration existed between the cattle and their caretakers as they stand present before a lens that sought to sever their affective ties, to reduce the cattle to quantifiable parts and the humans to their stilling appendages during the camera's exposure. As Christopher Penny reminds us, no matter how precautionary and punctilious the photographer is in arranging everything that is placed before the camera, the lens's inability to discriminate will ensure a substrate or margin of excess. In that margin of excess is where different political imaginaries exist beyond the photographer's intent. The camera repeatedly captures the decorative elements of cattle that Wallace needs to explain away. And as you can see with the image on the right, the camera captures the peasant who squats during exposure to ensure his bull receives pride of place and who chooses to gaze up toward him instead of towards the lens, an example of the fleeting presence of affect of which Elizabeth Edwards speaks. There are many examples of effective bonds between Indian peasants and their cattle that seep through the bureaucratizing forces of the colonial archive, and which run parallel to the effective bonds intonated in the cattle accessorizing that repeatedly slip into the frame of Wallace's photographs. For example, Indians attempted multiple forms of kindness and care toward cattle, even in times of famine. Cattle were regularly sent to sanctuaries when owners could no longer care for them or when they were no longer able to productively work. And these sites frequently became overwhelmed during famines. Further, cattle deemed too weak or useless by the British to be granted admission to cattle camps during famines were often supported by indigenous systems of charitable donations. Such systems enraged colonial officials who saw them as an indiscriminate waste of resources in times of scarcity and as also undermining to their policy, but they were unable to do anything to prevent them. These systems of indigenous care are quite different, even antithetical, to the systems of care we see in catalogs of prize-winning cattle from the domestic British competitions. A cattle's individual traits are emphasized, their parentage highlighted, and loving anecdotes are sometimes highlighted or provided, only to conclude proudly with the date they were sent to slaughter. So to whatever degree cattle like Lady Fragrant and the Nubis ox were anthropomorphized, doted on by their caretaker, and adored in competitions, it was never questioned that they were anything other than commodities. The British typically framed the effective ties Indians held for their cattle and the alternative models of care and aid they engendered as the result of superstition broadly and Hinduism specifically. But the few voices we do hear in this history considerably complicate this narrative by instead emphasizing the intimately connected nature of peasant and bovine well-being and survival. For example, a local Indian paper published in Bengal implored the government to end the practice of cow killing for meat, not on religious grounds, but to guard against the scarcity of ghee. British beef eating habits were sure to end in ghee becoming a product affordable only to the elite classes. Riled at having their own cultural practices called into question, the staff writers of the Agricultural Gazette of India offer a highly paternalistic and condescending retort, putting all blame back on Hindu ignorance and neglect of cattle for any shortage of ghee that may be suffered. But the authors then go on to at least acknowledge the one fallacy and what is their seemingly simple plan to just get Indians to feed their cattle better, when they state, "It is all very well to talk of an improved breed of cattle, and no doubt improved breeds could easily be introduced if we had the primary condition for their improvement, namely food." In a letter to the editor of the Indian Daily News, likewise, one impassioned reader is painfully honest about the role of British policy in shaping Riot's ongoing dearth of food. He states that it is the bad land tenure which is a barrier to improvement. You seem to attach too much value to education, unaided by sound and just laws. Indeed, it required significant rhetorical maneuvering to sidestep the failures and contradictions of Raj government policy that had brought the riots to their current condition. Roger Wallace, on the other hand, never criticized the government's land tenure and trade policies. His deep training in scientific methods and agriculture made him obtuse to matters of economics and politics. He believed firmly that the answer to India's agricultural woes was to be found in improvement through education. Nonetheless, he expressed hope that government would one day invest far better resources in building a strong agricultural department to educate India's peasantry, even if it was another famine of a magnitude not before seen that would lead the Raj to understand the importance of doing so. He states in an article he wrote, "A great famine with the sacrifice of some millions of lives and with the suffering and demoralization of millions more of our native fellow subjects appears to me as likely to be the precursor of the establishment of an agricultural department on a proper basis, something that will rouse popular feeling and through it stimulate government to action." So Wallace here uses recourse to strong language of moral sentimentality and fellow feeling, even implying that Indians, our native fellow subjects as he describes them, are equal members of the nation's body politic. As with famine photography, he attempts to leverage affect through the acceptable parameters of colonial ideology. He is spurred by the belief that there would be some threshold of tragedy in the moral imaginary of the Raj that would ultimately compel it to invest properly in agricultural education and improvement. But Wallace incidentally betrays his view that improving agricultural quality would alone result in Riot self-sustainability while discussing one particular bull represented in his book. In this accompanying text for this photograph of a Punganore bull, Wallace narrates, "The bull shown here with a hedge of madras thorn as a background is one of the few remaining specimens of this valuable breed, now almost extinct, having nearly died out along with the owners during one of the recent famines. The few survivors got crossed with inferior cattle, there being no one to care for them." So behind the seemingly face value portrait type of an exceptionally well-bred Punganore bull is the specter of extinction. Extinction of his human keepers, of his kin, of his entire kind. The illusory forms in this photograph themselves seem premonitory. The keeper's upper body, who you can barely see here at left, dissolves entirely into a sea of black madras thorn behind him. The bull's central torso is nearly transmuted into a vacant mass by the bleaching sunlight. No amount of exceptional husbandry, as embodied by this Punganore bull, no amount of training to produce Greek athletes instead of Indian babus can quell the onslaught of famine within the economic structures of the Raj. Educating one's way to self-sustainability, as even its biggest champion unwittingly affirms, is a ploy and a myth. Thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen now. There.
Thank you for this fascinating and richly generative discussion of the constitutive role that photography plays in the discursive construction of the Indian peasant as what you refer to as a self-contained economic actor through photographs of his bovine counterpart in the late 19th century. Liza, your attunement to photographs of cattle in the context of famines at the time, which have been largely overlooked in historical and art historical studies, often in favor of images of emaciated bodies, particularly of women and children, highlights their role in the colonial state's characterization of the famine as an event rather than a structure, actively shaped by its ideology of economic liberalism, and in the service of its extractive agricultural and trade policies. Now, as people gather their thoughts and type their questions into the Q&A box, I would like to start us off with one question, which is actually a two-part question. Your research has shown, does your research actually show evidence of the dissemination of images of prize-winning cattle to their owners or farmers, or their reproduction in any way outside the government circles where they were used as illustrations for reports on agricultural fairs and surveys? I ask this because the formal aspects of the photographs, that is framing cattle in the middle ground in a way that focuses on their anatomy or physicality, in association with the date of their publication, which is broadly between the 1870s and 1880s, seems to anticipate visualizations of cows in lithographs that were produced and disseminated as part of the cow protection agitation, which begins from the 1890s onwards. So the first part of this two-part question is firstly to ask in what ways the famine informed and animated the cow protection agitations from the 1880s onwards. And relatedly, given the way visual anthropologists and art historians like Christopher Pinney, Jyotinder Jain, and Kajri Jain have addressed the frontal aesthetics of those images, ranging from the 1890s up to the 1910s or 20s. I was wondering whether your archive points to the kinds of images the producers of those mass-produced images drew on, and in what ways this possibility might contribute to the tension you point to between the photograph as type and the photograph as portrait, which points to the affective ties between peasants and their cattle.
Yes, great question. So firstly, unfortunately, we do not have any sort of evidence of where these things, where the photographs ended up, besides the fact that they are in the sort of archaeological survey of India's collections indicates that they serve some sort of government purpose. And so that's what leads me to conclude, along with Roger Wallace's photograph of the Bombay Agricultural School and the way that maquettes and vignettes of cattle were being used, that these photographs were probably most certainly going towards that. But it's unclear the extent to which these would have been brought back by prize winners and used. At the same, so it is possible that the kind of format of these photographs did influence in some way some of the more mass-produced lithographs that you're speaking of related to the cow protection movement that ramps up in the 1880s. I also think that there's something to the way in which those lithographs that you're speaking of, it's a composition that, while may be influenced by this kind of composition, also makes sense for the sole purposes for which those compositions are being used, which is that oftentimes with lithographs of the cow protection movement, the cow's body is used as a way to insert many different vignettes of different deities or different figures, if I'm thinking of the same images that you're thinking of related to the cow protection movement. And so there is something practical compositionally about showing the cattle from the side in that way to kind of encompass the broader ideology of the cow protection movement by literally encompassing multiple figures within the cow's body that couldn't be achieved if it were in a different location, if it were positioned differently in a composition. Having said that, you're also raising, I think, what is an interesting issue and one that I sort of sidestepped, which is I sort of completely ignored the cow protection movement in my paper. And it's not to say that I don't think that they are connected. I think more than anything, I wanted to sidestep what was a kind of overdetermined representation of cattle in a South Asian context, of always kind of bringing it back to a kind of Hindu nationalist framework. And so I perhaps sidestepped it in a way that is too much, but I did want to highlight that I do think that there is a relationship that's being posited between Indian peasants and cattle here that exceeds the Hindu nationalism and the cow protection movement. And it is largely determined by the kind of intimate nature of survival, that both are codependent on one another, which I think exceeds in many ways some of the ideologies of the cow protection movement. But it's something that I haven't fully grappled with yet in terms of the extent to which I want to go in that direction. Thank you for that response, Liza. And I think I absolutely agree. The
that the focus of your talk and the importance of locating this archive, not only as it speaks to the cow protection movement and the Hindu nationalist framework, is of course important and urgent. So in that sense, I think this work opens up new ways to think about the colonial state's mobilization of the camera as a disciplining technology, not only as it relates to subjects, as in the much discussed People of India series and ethnographic photography more broadly, but as it relates to animals, to land, and the environment more broadly, as well as the ways in which this logic is interrupted. So could I ask you to sort of reflect upon the broader stakes of the project in perhaps being invested in this question of an environmentally attuned or critically attuned history of colonialism?
Yeah, sure. So I think one thing I'm particularly interested in under this broader rubric of thinking about how photography helped constitute colonial policy around famine in India is the way in which it was involved in a rethinking about the relationship of the human to the land. And one of the ways that I see that happening in particular, and unfortunately I don't have any examples to show you, is in a lot of along with these cow competitions, a lot of the focus of British policy was not on intervention as much as it was on the application of what it called sound principles. So, sort of ameliorative policies in advance of famine so that they didn't have to redirect grain and that they could provide relief in the cheapest manner possible to government. And so one of the ways that that's happening is with the way that they're thinking about land. And I think that's really interesting within the broader context of the British in India, because in the 18th century, when the British first arrived in India, there is a general idea, and this is one of the reasons why, for example, Warren Hastings' trial was such a kind of so surprising to British audiences. There was a general idea that India was too sublime and large to be contained and controlled. And so it was surprising to learn that Hastings was actively involved in, bribery and extortion and things that showed a very heavy controlling hand in Indian affairs. And I think over the course of the 19th century, that begins to shift, where we see, as Britain becomes more integrated into the subcontinent, a more picturesque approach pertaining to representations of India's land, more framed within European pictorial conventions, but still very much identified as an Indian landscape. And what I see happening with photography at this moment in time with land is a kind of absolutely kind of chauvinistic remaking of land altogether. And so it's a complete 180 from where it began in the middle of the 18th century. And I'm thinking particularly with representations of really large irrigation projects and dam projects, which were really central to this endeavor too. There is an effort to disseminate information about the kinds of irrigation projects that are being implemented to forestall famine. And also, I'm thinking of one album in particular of a dam that was made in South India, which actually ended up not getting the amount of government funds it needed. It was completed by private investors, which is a complete just overhaul and remaking of India's land, taking a landscape and completely remaking it in a different kind of image. And that is, I think, really a testament to a larger project of what it's reflective of the larger project the British were trying to achieve with India's land and the level of kind of hubris that was required to take that project on. And I think that it really speaks to the way in which they also tried to divert attention away from policy by instead focusing on the land as the kind of enemy of plenty. And it was through their policies and their correctives and their reshaping of the land that they could change this and they could ameliorate the situation. And so I see the ways in which land is being thought about as pretty fundamental to the project. Does that answer your question?
It certainly does, Liza. I want to let all the attendees know that they are free to write in their question in the Q&A box, and I'd be happy to read it out. So in the meanwhile, I'll ask another question, Liza, which relates to the figure of Willoughby Wallace Hooper, You began your presentation with a reference to his photograph and also a reference to his having been transferred based on photographs he'd taken of, at least in the written version of the presentation, of a prior photograph he'd taken. While listening to your presentation, I was thinking about Christopher Penny's book, The Coming of Photography in India, where Penny takes up the idea of photography as a cure for the colonial state that quickly turns into photography as poison that comes to sort of attack the colonial disciplinary framework and the ways in which photography is marshaled towards it. And I see Willoughby Wallace Hooper's images contributing to the ways in which you are sort of framing the context for the enclosing of land and the enclosing mechanisms of subjects, animals, the environment more broadly. Could you tell us a little more about Willoughby Wallace Hooper's sort of images and whether there are any sort of written records about his sort of not perhaps active role, but the role of his images in enabling these forms of sort of not just constituting this sort of colonial archive, but actually questioning and enabling questioning of its active disciplining practices?
Yeah, so great question. So yeah, as I mentioned in my talk, Hooper came to Madras from Burma. It's unclear whether he was removed from Burma because of the fact that he was taking photographs with the permission of the prisoner, with the warden of prisoners as they were being executed. His aim was to try to photograph them as the bullet was entering them, to get a sense. It was kind of like a, you know, those sort of like motion photographs, but on executions instead of animals. So it's unclear if he got removed for that reason and restationed. What happened in the 1880s, though, is that word of this event, of the fact that this happened, reached a journalist who ended up publishing about it, and it resulted in a huge outcry of public uproar about this event. The journalist exaggerated the claims a little bit, saying that Hooper was actively sort of orchestrating the execution so that he could photograph at the right time. That part wasn't actually true. But nonetheless, this resulted in a huge sort of public scandal in Parliament, and it ultimately led to Hooper being dismissed as a colonial administrator. But before that time, in the 1870s, when he's in Madras, after being stationed in Burma, he begins producing, you know, the images that I showed of him today are pretty mild. I referenced the macabre nature of his images, and these are pretty mild in terms of what his general style was. And what he's most known for, and what often gets most reproduced, are his photographs of these extremely emaciated bodies during the Madras famine of the 1870s, of the late 1870s. Usually groupings of people who are genuinely on the verge of death at any moment. And it's interesting because, you know, Zahed Chowdhury talks about these photographs in terms of the fact that on one hand, they claim to speak to that kind of moral sentimentality that drew British viewers in and solicited colonial humanitarianism. But at the same time, the level of macabreness in them actually exceeds the limits of moral sentimentality. And it shows the kind of grotesqueness of British policy as a result. And so it has this unintended effect of saying, well, they're in a famine camp and they're being helped by the British, but how is it that they ever got to this point to begin with? And so that became a kind of critique of British policy, and perhaps inadvertently it's not known. And so I absolutely think that, you know, Hooper is one of these figures that is kind of instrumental in questioning British policy. Having said that, I don't think his goal was to critique British policy. I think he himself had an incredibly macabre sense of relationship to his subject matters. And there is a certain degree in which I think he kind of enjoyed the macabreness. So the goal of his taking those photographs wasn't moral outrage, but that did end up being kind of the consequence regardless. So yeah.
Thanks, Liza. We have a question in the audience, and I'll just allow the speaker to ask the question themselves.
Hello.
Hi, we can hear you.
Can you hear me? All right. Hi, my name is Mir Toriano, and I have a bit of a selfish question as I posed it in the Q&A. And I was curious to know a little bit about those agricultural trials that involve plow usage, I think, and other tools and implements that you mentioned briefly. And I've written about peasant competitions a long time ago in 1920s Punjab, so a lot later, in different parts of India, but these were very systematized trials of how many acres different castes can plow. It was really quite intense. And I was thinking about it in terms of genealogies of scientific management, and I'd never heard of anything before the 1920s. So I'm just curious if these things were common and what actually happened during these trials. And relatedly, if we're talking about the cattle side of things, were these cattle judged purely on aesthetics or breed standards, things like that, or also on performance in some way, where they actually put to work and evaluated in those ways?
So to the second part of your question on performance, there's no indication in any of the records I've come across that they were put toward, that there was any sort of performance element involved in their ranking, that it was strictly aesthetic. With regard to the agricultural trials I mentioned, so I can't say the extent to which there were many of these. I've only come across the one reference I mentioned, which was at the Presidency Jail in Calcutta in 1876, I think it was. And I'll be happy to send you the reference to that from the India office records. If I can get your email, I'll remember your name and send it to you. But the extent to which they were standardized within and that it was in common practice, I don't think it was not at this point entirely. I think that they were few and far between, but I think what was more common practice was the general use of prisoners to consider all sorts of questions, whether that be plow trials or whether that be calorie studies for figuring out the minimum nutrition requirements for those suffering from famine. And so I think, even though it doesn't speak yet to a kind of consistency of a systematization of these kinds of trials, it does speak to sort of prisons being epicenters of the place where these kinds of questions were asked and first conducted.
Liza, in relation to the discussion by Wallace in particular of the ways in which the cattle was often adorned with various kinds of ornaments, I was wondering if your archives point to any reference to the ways in which these cattle fairs were, at least in the initial phase, experienced by people participating in it. Was there an overlap in their participation in the fair, which is a strictly sort of economic endeavor and novel in that sense, and the practice of religious festivals that involved animals and cattle in particular?
So the British didn't invent these fairs. Actually, they sort of predate the British in that they originally existed as exchange places for the buying and selling of cattle, where multiple villages would get together and kind of have their annual exchange of cattle for. So that's where they began. And we see the British involve themselves actually very early on in one of these endeavors, because they say, well, let's use this space that's already here and that already exists to go and propose a competition for prize money. And what ended up happening, I can't remember exactly where that was located. The story is that when villagers got word of the fact that they were going to be offered money for no other reason than potentially showcasing their cattle, they became incredibly suspicious that the British were actually trying to use this as an opportunity to steal their cattle away from them. And so nobody actually showed up, or there were very poor attendees. And so it really kind of put a damper on the annual trade of cattle that would have otherwise happened. And so it's only through increasing the prize amounts that many more people start to come to these on a more regular basis, and through that learning that it's not going to be a place where their cattle are stolen, but they actually will receive a prize award in some way. But then there's a kind of shift, and the British move away from using these already existing cattle exchanges and instead start instituting their own fairs once word gets around that these competitions kind of exist. And in those, there is no sense that there's, of course, this is through the Colonial Archive. And so, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but there's no sense in which there's sort of other kinds of rituals or religious practices at these. There is a sense of, like I mentioned, colonial fairs mirroring what was happening in Europe with large displays of industrial tools that were, industrialized kind of agricultural tools, and showcasing of artifacts from newly colonized territories such as Burma in the 1870s. They all of a sudden start bringing artifacts from Burma to showcase. And so there is a way in which it is mirroring those fairs in Europe. But I think more generally, unlike what's happening in Europe, which is a kind of a chauvinistic display for your fellow European neighbors and to the Europeans who are going to be visiting there, the purpose of these fairs were largely more didactic. And it wasn't just about breeding practices, it was more broadly about incorporating India's peasantry into this idea of historical progress more broadly, right? And this idea of we are progressing and this is modernity and here's how you can be a part of it.
Thank you for that, Liza. I'll turn to another question that I was thinking of through your course of your presentation, which was in the light of recent literature by art historians focused on the visualization of famines from the late colonial decades. Is there a way in which your work or your reflections on your work in this ongoing book project can contribute to sort of deepening of the history of the visualizations of famine in ways in which that does not perhaps directly sort of animate the work of modernist artists from the 1930s onwards, but certainly informs a deeper history of the visual culture of famines, going back to the 19th century?
I do think so. I think, what we see with, for example, with the Bengal famine in the 40s is, the nationalist movement is at its peak. And so there is a lot of kind of protest art and protest photography that is happening at that moment in time. Whereas what I'm looking at, that hasn't yet developed at this moment in time, particularly, at least not around famine, in the 1870s and the 1880s. And instead, what I'm looking at are these really kind of mundane and boring images of like infrastructure and cattle competition. This isn't the most exciting imagery. And I think that's one of the reasons why it hasn't been looked at. But I think that's also part of the problem with the way in which famine imagery gets reproduced and talked about too, is that it is, as I mentioned in the longer draft of my paper that you have, it's a way of the kind of repetition of emaciated bodies is a way of anonymizing famine victims. It's a way of kind of removing from historical context the events of any famine and the reasons why they occurred, and viewing famine as this kind of ahistorical thing because of the way it's represented. And I think that's true even in media representations today. But I think that if we look at the protest art around famine in the 40s or during Bengal, I think that looking at these really more boring and mundane images around cattle competitions, they historicize famine policy for us in a way that gives us a better sense of exactly what those artists were responding to and reacting against. And it wasn't just a famine, it was a larger structure of policy that they were reacting to. And I think these kinds of photographs that I'm dealing with engage in those policies much more in depth to illuminate them.
Thank you, Liza. And I want to take this opportunity to thank you for a really fascinating talk, presentation, and for so generously responding to these questions. And I also look forward to how the book project shapes up. And thank you to everybody for tuning in, and good night.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.